Tell us a little bit about the grain deal and it going away, and what that could potentially mean for the rest of the world, because it's a big deal. There's a lot of food that comes out of Ukraine and Russia, more than most people would expect.
Well, the first thing that we have to understand is that it was a grain deal, meaning that it wasn't a one-way street for Ukraine to ship grain. That Russia, in order for Russia to allow this grain to come out of the Black Sea, Russia needed to be permitted to ship its own grain out of Crimea, but also fertilizer. Russia ships a lot of fertilizer, and that's an important part of the world's food supply, because if you're not fertilizing the crops don't grow. And and so Russia is one of the largest providers of ammonium nitrates of the fertilizers. Um, Neither Ukraine nor the West have lived up to their end of the deal. They've embargoed Russian ships containing fertilizers in the European ports. They've interfered with Russia's ability to participate by blocking Russia from the SWIFT banking system, which allows banks to communicate. And if you can't have banks communicate, money can't be moved. If money can't be moved, ships can't be done. They've attacked the ability of Russia to ensure their shipping. They've done everything, Ukraine and the West, everything necessary to ensure that Russia cannot participate. And Russia just got fed up with it. They basically said, if we can't participate, then this deal is done. Plus, Russia had to turn a blind eye to the fact that Ukraine was more than likely using the green corridor and the ships involved in moving the grain as a covert means of resupplying Ukraine with weaponry. That the empty ships going in were containing weapons. Russia believes that the explosives used to drop the bridge first time came out of Odessa on one of these ships. So Russia's always had a very skeptical look at this, and I think Russia just finally said enough is enough. We're done with this. Now, what is the impact of this going to be? First and foremost, there's a lot of propaganda going around. I mean, right now, the president of Ukraine is saying that Russia is trying to put billions of people lives at risk by denying them access to the food. But that's not how this works. The Ukrainian grain is not going to people who need food. The majority of the Ukrainian grain is actually going to Europe, to European markets. Now, does that mean that there's no relationship between that grain and the people who need it? No, there's a direct relationship. The World Food Program, the people that provide the foodstuffs to the people in need, they produce specific consumables that are delivered. But these consumables are produced separately. What's key to them is the price. If I'm running a humanitarian program, I'm not allocated food from a warehouse. I'm allocated money to buy the food. So now, if you deny this shipment, look what happened to world commodity prices. When the grain deal went down, commodity prices shot up. And when commodity prices shoot up, the price of food goes up. And when the price of food goes up, the budgets which were allocated to these humanitarian groups, they don't go up. So suddenly their budgets are able to buy less food. It's not that there's no food, it's that they can't buy as much food as they needed. And this is the system. Now, what Russia's been saying is they want to shortcut that, because rather than have all these middlemen, because there's a lot of politics in play. To give you an example, the United States is a heavy contributor to this thing. But when Congress wrote the laws allowing the United States to participate in this, they wrote the laws so that whatever we do must be beneficial to the American farmer. That it's not about feeding the world, it's about making money for the American farmer. And that's how much of this goes. It's not as humanitarian and pure of heart as people might think. What Russia's been saying is, we'll just deliver the food straight to the people that need it. We're going to cut out the middleman. If Ukraine can't do it, we'll do it. We grow enough food, we can send this food in and do this. Another key element here is Turkey. Turkey is the middleman here. It not only does the grain go through the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, but most of the grain that comes out of Ukraine is raw grain. In Turkey, they've established a giant industry that mills it into flour and then bags it. And it's this product that then is sent on. And so Turkey's going to lose a lot of money when this grain deal is shut down, because all those mills that they had, and this is the wrong time for Turkey to lose an important element of its economy, because it's the lira is in free fall. The Turkish economy is in a strain. One of the reasons why Turkey backtracked on letting Sweden into NATO, because you remember Turkey was saying no, 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 and all of a sudden they went okay, was that the United States put pressure on the International Monetary Fund to free up 11 to 13 billion dollars that would be infused into the Turkish economy. So Turkey's received the initial tranche of this money and they're investing it, but now they've suffered an economic hit that's even greater than the money received because of the grain deal. So there's a lot of politics at play in this grain deal. It's not only about starving people in Africa. It's about the control of the global food supply. It's about food prices. Look, England doesn't receive any of the grain from Ukraine. But the last time there was a crisis, the price of fish and chips went through the roof. And the price of food in the British markets went through the roof. And the British suddenly couldn't afford to eat. That's what's going to happen here. There's going to be, because this is a commodity, the commodity is exchanged. Exchanges are based upon confidence and stability. This is instability, dropping confidence. You're going to see food prices go up. And it's the high price of food that's going to cause the global food crisis, not the lack of food. It's not that there isn't any food available. There is food available. It's just that the people whose job is to provide the food to the starving people don't have enough money.
Wow. It's amazing how we're all, connected, even though the world is so big. It's also so amazing to me that, just how much of our problems revolve around money and fighting over money and territory. Let's switch gears, as I mentioned, the Wagner group, the Progohzin. I want to talk about the post-rebellion situation. What is going to be the new role of the Wagner mercenary group, and what do you think will be the new role of Progohzin going forward?
I'll answer the easy part first. I think Progohzin is done. Progohzin was a protege of Putin. He's somebody who Putin, I guess, developed a liking to. In St. Petersburg, he was a caterer of food. He had a restaurant that became popular. Putin entertained international visitors at this restaurant, felt that they were treated properly, invited Progohzin to cater other Kremlin events. And so Progohzin got the reputation of being Putin's chef. Well, he wasn't Putin's chef. That's the furthest thing from the truth. But what he was done is he got into the inner circle. He got invited on the inner circle. It was like, okay, come on in. You're in the inner circle now. And people started going to his restaurants for business. His business expanded. And as it expanded, his political footprint expanded. But remember, everything about Progohzin relates to Putin. If Putin decided that Progohzin had bad breath and he didn't want him in the inner circle anymore, Progohzin's gone. And Progohzin forgot that. He forgot that he's there solely because Vladimir Putin has allowed him to be there. Progohzin in May of 2014 helped create Wagner. Wagner existed prior. That wasn't called Wagner. It was a private military contractor run by a guy named Utkin. He's a Russian special forces commando who had retired, and he was working on behalf of the Russian military intelligence to solve some of the problems that were related to Crimea. Remember, we talked earlier about Crimea being taken over by the Russians. Well, initially, Crimea was Ukrainian territory, and by law, Russian forces can't operate on Ukrainian territory without the permission of the Russian parliament. So Utkin's mercenary force was created, the Little Green Men, who basically went in and and did the dirty work, got Crimea under control, and then it became Russia. They moved to the Donbass, and they were providing assistance to the ethnic Russians who were resisting the Ukrainian nationalists. And they did that from 2014 on. In 2014, they were created May 1st. There's a founding document that we're now aware of because the Russian FSB, their FBI, did a raid on Prigozhin's mansion, and he took a photograph of it. So you get to see the founding document and what the roles and stuff are. And one of the interesting things about Prigozhin, one of his roles was to ensure that the fighters for Wagner could not be prosecuted under the Russian law that prohibits mercenary groups. There's a Russian law, 10 to 15 year sentence if you are a mercenary, and all these guys are breaking the law. But Prigozhin's job was to make sure that they weren't prosecuted, which means that Prigozhin is using his political connections, that Prigozhin is able to call somebody and say, if you want this done, this law has to be ignored. And it was successful. But it was successful not because Prigozhin made it happen. It was successful because somebody else did it, because Prigozhin was providing a service that was useful to Russia. And May 1st, and May 1st is an important date here because Russia is a very contractual, legal nation. Everything's done by the book, by the law, by the contract. And so Prigozhin signed a contract, a one-year contract, starting May 1st, 2014. Every May 1st, that contract would get upped. On May 1st, 2022, that contract got expanded. This group called Wagner Group went from basically 500 guys to 30,000 guys, a massive expansion of the contract, approved by the Russian state, that means Putin, $940 million. And as a sweetener, because this was a big project, as a sweetener, Putin had the Ministry of Defense give Prigozhin the food contract, another $1 billion to provide food to the Russian military. So Prigozhin suddenly became a very, very wealthy man. $2 billion contract, etc. The problem for Prigozhin began in September of 2022 when Russia annexed the Donbass, Lugansk in particular, where the Wagner fighters were based, into Russia. And now we have a problem. You see, Putin could ignore the federal law 296 or whatever it was about mercenaries as long as Wagner wasn't operating on Russian soil. Wagner was operating on the soil of Lugansk. Wagner was operating in Syria. Wagner was operating in Africa. That ain't Russian soil. But now that Russia annexed Lugansk, that's Russian soil. Now they have a problem. And Putin can't make Russian law go away. He's not a dictator. Saddam Hussein could have done that. Stalin could have done that. Putin can't do it because he's not a dictator. So the Ministry of Defense called up Prigozhin and said, look, we have a contract. We're going to honor the contract. But on May 1st, 2023, your status ends and you have to sign new contracts with the Ministry of Defense. You stop being a private military contractor and you have to become a volunteer military force working for the Ministry of Defense, which means that the money for this force now comes through the Ministry of Defense, not Prigozhin. Prigozhin's no longer the richest man, a rich man. And Prigozhin didn't want this. He started a public relations campaign promoting Wagner, diminishing the Ministry of Defense, etc. And it led to the events of June of this year, June 23rd, 24th, where he led a revolt. Vladimir Putin has called what he did treason, accurately so. Part of the deal is that Prigozhin will not be prosecuted for the events of those 2 days. But he is not going to be in charge of Wagner going forward. Someone else is going to take over. I think they've already named the person that's going to be doing this. One of the senior Wagner military commanders will take over. There's a person who's a general director. He'll move up. But Prigozhin's out. He's done. He lost his food contract, and he lost the Wagner contract, and he's being prosecuted for corruption. The food contract, in particular, the Russians are looking at it how Prigozhin stole money and enriched himself. How did he build this mansion? How did he do all that? So Prigozhin his life going forward is going to be different from the life it was. Wagner, on the other hand, is a different problem set. Prigozhin is an individual who betrayed Putin, and so he'll be treated in that way. Wagner, however, is a military force that has taken on legendary proportions. The Russian people, for good cause, view them as heroes. These are guys who went in there and they developed an approach to war that was very successful at a time when the rest of the Russian military wasn't as successful. And again, the Progohzin public relations campaign elevated Wagner. They made a movie, a feature-length movie earlier this year, Best in Hell, I think it is. I watched the movie. It is very well done. It is compelling. I mean, you're just at the edge of the seat the whole time. Anybody who's into, war flicks and all that stuff, watch it. It's entertaining. It's violent. I'll warn you about that. Very realistic. It's also very evenly balanced. It doesn't talk about Russians versus Ukrainians, but white versus yellow. And it treats the yellow guys with honor and dignity. It treats them as honorable opponents. It's not this propaganda piece that's turning them all into Nazis and everything. It's basically, there's one scene in the movie. It's very, very telling. They're fighting for a building, and an icon, Orthodox icon, gets knocked off the wall. And the Russian soldier, when he comes in, sees it, crosses himself, picks the icon up, puts it back on. Later, when the Ukrainians counterattack, the icon falls, and the Ukrainian soldier comes in, sees it, crosses himself, puts it back on the wall. They create this moral equivalency of this fight. And again, this was a film produced by Prigozhin, produced by Wagner, put out there. But it's part of the public relations spin that turned a very effective combative force into a mythology. It's mythologized. They become heroes. And when the rebellion took place, the interesting thing is that the majority of the Wagner guys did not support Prigozhin. They stayed in their camps. Only a few went up, and those few that went up, most of them were told one thing. They were told that they were going there to secure the border. They weren't told that they were moving on Moscow. Mm-hmm. So there's that. So, and because a lot of people say, well, why didn't Putin just slaughter them? Why didn't you, because they're betrayed. They're moving on Moscow. Why didn't you just kill them all? Especially when they shot down, 6 aircraft, killed 15 Russian pilots. Why not kill them all? And the answer is, you could have started a civil war. Because when you create a unit of such legendary status, if now, without further explanation, Russians start attacking them, first of all, it's Russian on Russian. It's a civil war already. You're attacking heroes of Russia, and you could lose some people. And 3, nobody came to Wagner's cause. As they moved up to Moscow, it became clear that nobody supported Prigozhin. And the commanders started to feel betrayed by Prigozhin. And so it was easier to solve this problem by striking a deal that nobody would be prosecuted for this if they just turned around and went back to camp. And they did. On July 29th, 5 days after the coup ended, Putin met with 36 guys in the Kremlin, 35 Wagner commanders and Prigozhin. And they had a very long discussion about what happened, about what Wagner's concerns were. What's interesting about this is when you read the founding document of Wagner, one of the principles of Wagner, both in terms of the director and the commanders, is that they resolve all disputes collegially and collectively, which means that everybody gets together and you put it out on the table and you resolve these disputes. And it's interesting that Putin, instead of being the chief executive and dictating a solution, Putin called everybody in and used their rules against them. He said, we have a problem. We're going to resolve this collectively, collegially. And the solution to it was simple. Wagner will no longer exist on Russian soil. It can't exist on Russian soil. There's no law for private military companies like this. So the Wagner force, this elite fighting force that existed in the Donbass, would be disbanded. They're done. But meanwhile, in Africa, Wagner has had, there's a large number of guys in Africa. into thousands, 5, 6 to 8,000 guys in Africa who were supposed to be rotated out, but because of the heavy fighting in Bakhmut, that they didn't do their rotation. So they're rotating out, they have to be replaced. So one of the deals that was cut with the Wagner commanders is your soldiers who were in Donbass, if they want to continue to work for Wagner, they can go to Africa. And they brought in these new soldiers that came back, and these new soldiers were given the option, not new soldiers, they brought in the African veterans who were given the choice of signing contracts with the Ministry of Defense or go to Belarus. Russia had been struggling for years to come up with a law that could make Wagner justified in other private military companies, and they couldn't. Lukashenko overnight passed a law that legitimized Wagner on his soil. And so now Wagner's coming in. They have a specific training mission. It could be expanded, but Wagner's transitioned to Belarus, where they're doing active training of the Belarusian army. Wagner still operates in Africa. They still have a connectivity via their St. Petersburg office with the Russian government about African operations, overseas operations. Wagner is alive. Wagner is well. Wagner is thriving. Prigozhin's out. That's where we're at.
Okay, thank you. That whole thing was had me on the edge of my seat when it was all going down. Colonel Douglas.
Me too.
Yeah. Oh, I
just
bet.
So you know, I mean, that's a Wagner patch.
Okay.
I've met with some of the founding members of Wagner. I have so when this happened, I was watching people that I knew, people that I have to be honest, I liked. They're nice people. They're professional people, and this tore me apart because I hate traitors. I despise people who betray a cause, and just like I wouldn't tolerate any American who turned against their government. I just I was from the Russian perspective, I was like, these guys can never serve Russia again because they betrayed their country. So this was not just me watching it as a disinterested observer. This was me watching people that I know, people that I like, do things that were very destructive, very damaging to their cause. And again, I'm not a Russian. At the end of the day, I go to sleep very well at night, regardless of what happens in Russia. But for them, I just realized that this was tearing their lives apart. This was a monumental action that could forever change everything, put their lives at risk. And so, in many ways, you have to applaud Vladimir Putin for the diplomacy and the leadership shown to take a situation that could very easily become a civil war and end up with the result that he got, where it's Russia's getting a lot of gains out of it. The only person to truly suffer here are, of course, the families of the 15 dead Russian service members who should never be forgotten here. They were murdered by Wagner, and of course Prigozhin, who I don't think too many people have sympathy for him anymore. So yeah.
Okay, final question. I appreciate all the time that you've given us today. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, in an interview with me and on other channels, has been talking more and more about Poland's potential future involvement in this conflict. If Russia is able to push further west, he says he could see Poland annexing part of Western Ukraine, justifying it as a way to protect the rest of Europe. They could also justify it as a way of saying, hey, it's a territorial dispute. Ukraine used to be part of Poland. We now have a big military presence. There's a big U.S. military presence there. Do you see Poland getting involved, or are they wanting to stay neutral unless it absolutely comes down to being the gateway to protect the rest of Europe?
Well, first of all, Poland's already involved. The Poles have been recruiting a Polish legion for some time now, several thousand strong, that's actively involved in the fighting. Again, anecdotal information coming out from the Russian side is that when they listen to the radio traffic of the Ukrainian forces opposite them, the number one language being spoken is Polish. Um, and there's a lot of dead bodies going back to Poland. So Poland's already involved indirectly, and it appears that the Legion is supported by Poland's intelligence services. So this isn't just a bunch of patriotic Poles going over there. This is a government action. Poland's been heavily involved in the provision of material support to the Ukrainian government. Poland is the logistical hub. One of the two, maybe the other one being Romania, logistical hub of support to Ukraine. So they're already involved. The question is, how are they going to escalate this, if they can escalate this? We have heard that Volodymyr Zelenskyy and President Duda of Poland have met on numerous occasions to talk about a union, to create a political union between Poland and Ukraine that would, in effect, eliminate the border between Poland and Ukraine, making Western Ukraine in particular unified with Poland. That is one possible way that Poland could get involved, is through a political union. Now, it's always a risky thing to do that in a time of war, but we're seeing desperate times right now. Ukraine is desperately looking for a path of survival. They're beyond a path of victory. They can't win. Everybody knows that now. It isn't going to happen. So now it's a path of survival. How do we survive this? And Poland, of course, has always had their eyes on the Western Ukrainian territories because once upon a time it was Poland. It's funny that Poland would want it back because that's the very area where the Volyn massacre took place 80 years ago. July 12th, in fact, was the 80th anniversary of the beginning of the Volyn massacre, the slaughter of 110,000 Poles by Ukrainian nationalists from 1943 to 1944. Women and children massacred, burned to death, gutted, horrific slaughter. And the Ukrainians have never apologized about this. So it's curious why the Poles would want to bring in this territory, but that's another question altogether. So there's any number of things. The former Secretary General of NATO, Rasmussen, had talked about Poland working together with the Baltic countries to create a coalition of the willing, not a NATO coalition, but a coalition of willing nations that could come in and intervene. If Russia, if as Colonel Macgregor and I both believe, anticipate the general collapse of the Ukrainian army is imminent, that could lead to a massive displacement of Ukrainian civilians, refugees, a second wave. Poland is in no position to absorb these refugees. So Poland would seek to keep them in Western Ukraine, but use that as an excuse to create a humanitarian zone as well. So there's any number of scenarios that can play out, all of which are not only possible, but many of them are probable. So I agree with Colonel Macgregor that Poland is going to find a way to become more closely involved. It's a very risky step because it could lead to direct military confrontation between Polish troops and Russian troops. And then, the question of what NATO does comes into play. NATO has done this before. Turkey, if you recall, is a NATO member who invaded Syria. And as a result, got into a direct contact with the Syrian army and the Russian army. And a couple of years ago, the Russians responded by attacking Turkish convoys, killing dozens of them. And Turkey appealed to NATO and said, we'd like NATO intervention under Article 4, not Article 5, but Article 4, common collective defense interests. And NATO went, nope, you're on your own. You did this without NATO permission, you're on your own. And that could be the case too for Poland and the Baltics if they get involved in Ukraine. We don't know, but it is a dangerous situation.
Yeah, it's we'll wrap up here, but it's almost like I feel like we're watching like a race, and on one side, Belarus is waiting for the baton to be passed and be put in the game, and Poland's waiting for their team to pass the baton and be put into the race, and I just think that leads to further and further escalation, and hopefully hopefully this thing will come to an end. Everybody finds it curious. They want to know this, but at the end of the day, I think everybody wants the killing to stop. And so hopefully it will. But Scott Ritter, thank you so much for coming on today's show and sharing the intel and the research that you do. It's invaluable, and we really appreciate you taking time. So thank you so much.
Thank you.